The atmosphere on the flight seemed normal at first, passengers finding their seats, the crew preparing for takeoff. But things took an unexpected turn when a flight attendant approached a black man in first class with an unwelcoming attitude. Her tone was cold, her words sharp, and it became clear she was questioning his right to be there. Passengers nearby exchanged uneasy glances, sensing something wasn't right. The man, calm yet visibly uncomfortable, tried to explain himself, but the flight attendant wasn't interested in hearing it. She insisted he must move. What no one on the plane realized was that this man wasn't just anyone. As whispers began spreading through the cabin, the situation escalated and tensions rose. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, the man revealed something about himself that left everyone, including the flight attendant, completely stunned. You won't believe what happened next. The passengers sat in awkward silence, their eyes darting between the man and the flight attendant. Whispers started spreading through the cabin, and a few people pulled out their phones, sensing something was about to happen. The man, dressed in a sharp suit, remained calm, his composure a stark contrast to the tension in the air. He quietly repeated that he had every right to be in first class, but the flight attendant wasn't backing down. Her insistence that he prove he belonged there felt personal, not procedural. Meanwhile, a young woman seated nearby watched the situation unfold with growing discomfort. She couldn't help but wonder why this man, who had done nothing wrong, was being singled out. The flight attendant's tone grew sharper, and she threatened to call security. The man sighed, clearly reluctant to escalate things further. Then, just as the tension reached its breaking point, he decided to speak. The man finally stood, towering slightly over the flight attendant. His voice was steady, yet firm, as he said, "You're making a mistake." The passengers leaned in, eager to hear what he would say next. The flight attendant, unfazed, crossed her arms and demanded once again for him to move or show proof he belonged in first class. The man reached into his pocket, but instead of pulling out a boarding pass, he held up a small badge. Gasps rippled through the cabin as a few people recognized it immediately. The flight attendant hesitated, her expression shifting, but she still didn't seem fully convinced. "I don't see how that changes anything," she said, her voice faltering just a little. Meanwhile, another flight attendant approached, clearly uneasy. "Is everything okay here?" she asked, glancing nervously between the two. From the back of the plane, an older man who had been quietly observing the entire scene stood up and began making his way forward. Something about him seemed familiar, though most passengers couldn't place why. As he approached, the energy in the cabin shifted, and the conflict suddenly felt even more layered than anyone could have imagined. Up, revealing something no one on that plane was ready for. The air in the cabin was thick with anticipation as the older man made his way toward the front. His calm yet authoritative demeanor seemed to command respect, and the passengers couldn't help but wonder who he was. The flight attendant's confidence wavered slightly, but she stood her ground, still focused on the black man she had been questioning. "This doesn't concern you, sir," she said to the older man, her voice laced with irritation. But the older man wasn't deterred. "It concerns all of us when someone is treated unfairly," he said, his tone measured but firm. He glanced at the man in the suit, who gave him a subtle nod. It was clear the two shared some unspoken understanding. The older man then turned to the flight attendant and said, "Before you take this any further, I suggest you think carefully about what you're doing." The tension was at its peak. Passengers whispered frantically, some recording the unfolding drama. The black man remained silent, his expression unreadable, but his calm demeanor only added to the mystery. The flight attendant, now visibly flustered, doubled down. "If he belongs here, he needs to prove it," she snapped. The older man let out a slow sigh and reached into his own pocket. What he pulled out made the entire cabin fall silent. The revelation was just seconds away, and everyone was on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how it would all unfold. The older man held up a badge, one nearly identical to the one the black man had shown earlier. The passengers froze, their eyes darting between the two men. The flight attendant's face paled as she realized these weren't just ordinary passengers. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" the older man said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. The flight attendant stammered, struggling to find her words, but before she could respond, a voice came from the back of the plane. "I think it's time we all hear the truth," a woman in business attire called out as she stepped into the aisle. The passengers turned to her, confused. She introduced herself as a legal professional and explained she had been watching the situation unfold. "Before this goes any further, I want to point out that both of these men have shown credentials that hold significant weight," she said, locking eyes with the flight attendant. "I suggest you reconsider your approach." The flight attendant, now visibly rattled, glanced at her co-worker for support, but none came. The black man finally spoke up, his voice calm yet commanding. "You're looking at me like I'm out of place," he said. "But maybe you should ask yourself why you assumed I didn't belong here." As the tension reached its breaking point, another passenger, this time a younger man seated a few rows back, stood up and pointed to his phone. "This is trending live right now," he said. "You might want to rethink how you're handling this." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the cabin. The stakes had just been raised higher than anyone could have imagined, and it was clear the situation wasn't going to end quietly. The cabin was completely silent, all eyes on the flight attendant as she stood frozen, processing what had just been said. The older man stepped forward, his tone steady but firm. "This man," he said, gesturing to the black passenger, "is not only authorized to be here, but he's a senior government official. And I'm his colleague." Gasps erupted from the passengers. The flight attendant's face turned ashen as she realized the gravity of her mistake. Before she could respond, the black man pulled out yet another piece of identification. This time, it was undeniable. His name and title were printed clearly, and it left no room for argument. "I tried to keep this simple," he said calmly, "but your assumptions turned it into something it didn't need to be." As murmurs filled the cabin, the younger passenger who had been recording spoke up again. "This is going viral. People need to see what happened here." The flight attendant, visibly shaken, began apologizing profusely, but the damage was done. Then came the twist no one saw coming. The captain emerged from the cockpit, alerted by the commotion. To everyone's surprise, he recognized the black man immediately. "Mr. Secretary," he said with a respectful nod, addressing him by title. "I had no idea you were on this flight. Please accept my apologies on behalf of the crew." The realization hit like a wave. This wasn't just any government official. This man was a member of the president's cabinet. The flight attendant's face crumbled as she stepped back, fully grasping the consequences of her actions. The black man looked around the cabin, meeting the eyes of the passengers who had supported him. "Let this be a reminder," he said calmly, "that judging someone by appearances only reveals your own limitations." With that, he sat back down, the tension dissolving into an air of quiet reflection, leaving everyone on board with a story they'd never forget. As the flight settled back into a calm rhythm, the atmosphere felt different, more reflective. The passengers who had quietly watched the events unfold seemed to carry a mix of guilt and admiration. Some whispered to each other, replaying what had just happened, while others glanced at the black man with newfound respect. The flight attendant, now humbled, quietly approached him with a sincere apology. "I was wrong," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I'm deeply sorry." The man looked at her, his expression softening. "Acknowledging that is a start," he said simply, offering her a chance to grow from the moment. As the plane began its descent, the older man leaned over to his colleague with a knowing smile. "You handled that with grace," he said. The black man nodded, replying, "Sometimes the best way to teach is by staying calm." The passengers left that flight with more than just a travel story. They left with a powerful reminder about respect, assumptions, and the importance of character over appearances.